my screen there and go from there.
I'm going to press the admit all. It says there's like 17 people in the waiting room.
So Dave's going to hit record. I'm going to do a welcome. As soon as it goes off.
Okay. And 3, 2, 1, Karen.
Well, there we have some people. Hi. Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Hi, good morning.
So I'm going to start by letting you all know that we've had, as you may have experienced, some power outage challenges. And so Lynn has asked me to welcome you all and introduce the final in our risk management series. Before I do that, I'm just going to acknowledge that wherever we are in Canada and joining on this virtual presentation, we are all on treaty land, and both the University of Regina and the Community Engagement and Research Centre and the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation acknowledge treaty land and are working towards reconciliation. So thanks again for joining us. I think Lynn is recording, or Dave has hit the record button, I'm hopeful. And we'll just get right into it. Thanks for making it. Thanks for having power. The Community Engagement and Research Centre, Lynn Goodlick, and the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation welcome you. And we're so pleased to offer this final in a 3-part series on financial and risk management for nonprofits. And unless Lynn has anything else to add to that, I will just turn this over to Dave Rosell. Dave Rosell has been fantastic. I've enjoyed the first 2 immensely and have learned a lot. Looking forward to finding out where his sleeping pills are. Dave, on to you.
Okay, risk. Okay, so first of all, what I decided I'd do is I just throw up something from dear old Merriam-Webster and see what this is. And really, I didn't find out anything that I didn't already know, okay? And it's all kinds of different things, and we can use it. What I didn't find out is we can use it as a noun or a transitive verb, but whichever way it goes. The problem what we have with risk is that it doesn't matter what we do, there's going to be some level of risk involved. Okay. We have to mute some people here. Okay. Anyway, it doesn't matter what it is, there's going to be some risk involved in it. Now, it reminds me of the old joke of the a couple of different formats, but you know, I was having an absolutely perfect day without any problem at all. And we went and ruined it by getting out of bed. So there's virtually no way we can avoid risk. Okay. So the problem that we've got is to excuse me just a second here. I'm just muting some people.
Yes, thank you, Dave. I just sent a reminder in chat. Please mute your audio, folks. Much appreciated.
Yeah, otherwise we'll be in an echo chamber. Okay, now you can unmute when you have a question. That's not an issue, but anyway, that aside. Okay, risk. We kind of know what it is. Okay, it's something that can do us some harm. Now the problem, of course, is that we can go from there. Now every organization is going to have risk, and you own it. Okay, you have to be prepared to deal with it. But the problem with it is that it can spread beyond your borders, and it can include impacts on others. Now, what I'm thinking here is in a very, not so much the not-for-profit world, but there's been some rather famous ones lately where you hear about how many thousands and thousands of credit cards have been stolen by somebody. And that is an IT risk, of course. But that was a risk to the organization, and they own it because of the fact that it was them that was storing the credit cards, but it impacted thousands and thousands of other people outside of their borders. Now, there's two types of risk out there. One's financial risk. Of course, that's basically whether we'll lose money or whether we won't. And there's reputational risk. And the two are related, but they're not the same. You can have financial risk that is a reputational risk, but you can also have a reputational risk that's not necessarily financial. Usually it will be, but not always. Okay. Now, there's two levels of responsibility for controlling this, and that's at the business as a whole and at an operational level. And one thing you have to remember in this is we can never eliminate it. At best, we're going to manage it. Okay? So, great. All right. We've got this beast out there that we know we have. We can't do much about it. At best, we can tame it a little bit. I'm not feeling any more comfortable than I was a few minutes ago. I don't know about the rest of you. Okay. So here's some comfort things. Okay. And maybe not. All right. But not every risk is an immediate problem, nor is every risk necessarily something that you need to worry about. I don't worry too much about getting hit by a car crossing the street if I'm walking anymore. I know it can happen. But if I obey the traffic signals and everything else, then the risk of that is not very high. But one of the other problems is that the 80-20 rule applies, but if you spend 80%, works in reverse. 80% of the work is spent on 20% of the risks. So we end up with thousands of risks out there, quite literally. And we're going to only deal with a few. All right. And you have to do that. You have to do that, okay? Because you cannot control absolutely everything. So you have to get this prioritized and prioritize your time for the money you're going to have to spend on actually managing the risk, okay? And some of it can be very simple, all right? Managing risk can be fairly simple. It's as simple as insurance policies. But some of it is very technical and very problematic. Now, I don't know the exact makeup of everybody in this group, but having said that, we all have computers now, we all face the internet, and it more depends on what is on your computers than whether it's facing the internet, because you cannot, once you're on the internet, whether you like it or not, you're in a risky situation. Okay, somebody can get there. Okay, but it depends on the sophistication and the level of sophistication, not the right word. It depends on the level of computerization that an organization has and what data they're storing on those computers. But before we move on, so what we're basically going on to here is what I want to do today is basically talk about a system of how you can figure out what your risks are and where you would put your time and effort. Because you can't control it, because you can't control where it's coming from most of the time, and because you can't necessarily deal with absolutely every one, you have to prioritize it. And where should I put my time and effort and money? So is there any questions before we move on to that? Okay, I've kind of got a short list of risk categorizing. And this is what I'm doing is I'm going through my experience on this. And I do teach this a little bit, but not as much as I do some of the other subjects I'm looking at. But this is what I do here at CEA Saskatchewan, where I work. Okay, well, the Royal Eye there's a lot more than me involved. However, it is my job to keep the CEO informed of what's going on in all of this. So what I did was I broke it down into some general basic categories so that I could start to look at different things that are in there. Okay. I'm going to go through each one of these individually, but there's a whole bunch there. You got strategic risk, financial, regulatory problems, you got operational problems, pandemics and disasters. You could have somebody sue you from legal point of view, or you did something wrong that ends you up in court. And probably the one that's the most difficult to deal with is the reputational one, but it's probably also one of the most important, simply because most of us are in the fundraising business. And of course, if our reputation is in the gutter, we're not going to be able to raise very much money to do what we want to do. Okay. So let's go through each one of these on an individual basis. Now, strategic risk is this kind of thing, okay? It affects the organization as a whole. And what I'm talking about here is things like relevance of the organization. Are we still relevant in what we're doing? Okay, are we still resonating with all populations that are out there? Okay. One of the things I know we faced years ago when I was in the working for CNIB was of course that we had a fundraising apparatus at that time that was a lot of older people. And we also had a lot of things that were happening that we considered good, okay? We considered them great because of the fact that it was cures for various things were coming along or various technology things were coming along. But it definitely put the relevance of us as an organization as we were at that time in doubt. So what do we have to do? Okay. Now, competing organizations can come along. Now, not often that happens, but it can happen. Somebody doesn't like what you're doing, so they say, okay, well, I'll start my own. Do it that way. You get disruptive technology. Something that you're doing is now on the internet. You get some loss of key players. This is anything from your own people to suppliers. And by suppliers, I mean suppliers of technology, suppliers of things that you use, suppliers of things that you have other people use, funders, all of those sorts of things. If you do have competing organizations, you're at a risk of a takeover. Okay. Often as not, scale gets into it. I'm either too small or I'm too big or I'm somewhere, not just right in any way. And if we're actually selling something, pricing can be an issue, again, particularly if there are competing organizations out there. But as you can see, this is kind of the stuff that's kind of at a holistic level that the whole organization has to look at. And it really gets down to the essence of why your organization exists right now and the size of your organization and what it really means to be doing what you're doing. And are you staying relevant to if you're keying in on younger generations, are you relevant to older generations? Or if you're keying in on older generations, are you going to be relevant to younger ones? And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here. So is there any questions on what the strategic level of risk is?
Or the opposite. I mean, the opposite also applies. When somebody uses, the triangle. And if you after you
Okay, sorry, but I just went through and muted some people again. We were getting some background noise. Okay. Now, financial risk is the next one, and it's probably the easiest one for us to get our mitts on because we're fairly familiar with it. If we lose all of our funding or if we have major expense changes, if there's a risk that this is going to happen, we know what this is. Okay. So this is probably the easiest one to get your head wrapped around, but it is major changes in your finances one way or another. Okay. And, it can have a bunch of different things, maybe fluctuations in your expense. I put benefit plans up there. Uh, if people have a defined benefit pension plan or have had one over the last probably 20 years, In the early 2000s, for sure, the cost of those plans went nuts. Now they're back to fully funded for most of the cases, but not so much anymore. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, something that's an expense within your organization. And of course, litigation could be environmental liabilities if you're dealing with anything hazardous. You know, what happens if all of a sudden we have a large increase in need for our services? All right. Something happens that all of a sudden we've got a whole bunch of people that are needing what we have right now. Are we able to cope with that? And all we have to do is ask SHA about that right now. Okay. Large decreases in revenue, somebody's ripping you off. And in most cases, interest and exchange rates don't bother people in this group too much, but they could if you're bringing in things from the United States or from Europe, or if you've got a significant loan on a building or something like that, if interest rates went nuts. I hate to say it, but I'm old enough to know when interest rates on houses and mortgages in the 80s were at 25%. Okay. And I bought my first house there, and it was subsidized in Saskatchewan down to 13%, and I thought I had the world by the tail. But anyway, you can see where the financial risk is probably the easiest one to get our heads wrapped around, because we're all familiar with something changing in price or various demand things happening very quickly. So is there any questions on that one?
When we leave bracket.
Does somebody have a question there? Or? Okay, and we'll move on to regulatory risk. Now, this is compliance issues. If you are a charity, loss of your charitable status would probably be fairly devastating. And fines or impairments, we don't want to necessarily have our operations restricted by the government or another regulator, and we don't want to pay a fine. And this is getting more and more all the time. Just let me get something here. This little booklet, you can see how thick it is and the size of it, and the print size of it, you maybe want to be able to see, but it's reasonably reasonable. It has about 20 pages in it, maybe 25. And that was the Income Tax Act in 1917, when they first brought it in as a, quotes, temporary measure to fund the First World War. Now, if you think regulators haven't gone nuts, this manual that is about 2 inches thick, twice the size, and the print is a quarter of the size, tells you what the Income Tax Act is today. So there is a risk of regulation out there, and it's not just that we're compliance, it's the fact that it could happen to us in the future. Okay, we're not regulated now, and we could be regulated later. Are there any questions on that one? Now, operational, okay, probably the most key one here is a loss of key people or a loss of a key supplier. But there's always a risk of us not being able to get people or get people that are educated in the ways that we want them to be and things like that. There's risks around our infrastructure. We found that out as early as this morning, right, Lynn? Power failures, things like that. If you are networked, computer networks and computer functionality, and probably the biggest one here is a data breach. Now that you don't need a computer to have a data breach, by the way, okay? You can have people carrying things out on paper or just releasing things that are not supposed to be released to individual people. And it can be as simple as somebody leaving their computer screen on and it's visible from a public point of view. Okay, so there's all kinds of operational things that could go wrong. And again, this one's not hard to get our heads wrapped around because again, it's things that we know we deal with on a daily basis. You know, if somebody quits, we got to replace them. And if they're a key person, it's more difficult. Okay. And I can remember in an organization where we lost the CEO. The guy had a heart attack. And there was some scrambling the next morning, believe me. Never mind everybody was in shock and didn't have any idea that it was just a great deal of problem. And we hadn't done a risk assessment on that, and we didn't have key man insurance and things like that. So it was a bit of a problem. Okay. But are there any questions on what an operational risk would be?
Dave, this is Karen.
Mhm.
I have a question. So, loss of network and computer functionality there. So that would be, as we experienced this morning with the power outage, with us, everything being virtual, this is more of a risk now than ever, I would say.
Mhm.
But not having a digital plan, in the face of the pandemic, was that a risk, or would that be considered operational? Like for those that hadn't, seen that, had some movement towards a digital plan already in place, et cetera?
Yeah. Some of these can cross lines. Okay. And if you were working towards having a more digital delivery service in the first place, then it probably was more strategic than it is operational. Okay. But if you weren't going that direction and you all of a sudden had to, now what's your problem, right? And how do you deliver services? The universities and schools and things like that. And since I work for a couple of them, um, you know, when this first came through a year ago, we had to change gears mid-semester. All right, albeit with only about 2 or 3 weeks left, but I at the time I wasn't doing one for the university, but I was doing two for Sask Polytech, and they closed down the school, and there was no intention of us having non-face-to-face classes the next day. So they closed down for a week in hopes that we could get it all working. And yeah, we made it work, but it was not a risk that I think was on anybody's particular radar, but I think should be. Now that's kind of a long answer to a short question, but yes, okay, we're getting more and more dependent on this. And you know what? I'd hate to see what happens if the internet crashed. Okay, because that now then means that we can't do things virtually either. So now what? Now, hopefully that doesn't scare people away too badly, but nevertheless, it is a possibility that's out there. Anything else? Well, disasters, guess what? We're in the middle of one. But the more common problems from disasters are things like, there's a fire in your office. And yeah, insurance will cover things like that, but guess what? It doesn't cover everything. And what happens if your computer burns and you don't have a backup someplace? And not everything's on your computer, so there are paper records that you'll lose. And then there's also the things that are just there, kind of valuable things that you need, but you're gone. Hazmat problems. Again, this is not necessarily your own, and it could be the dry cleaning store next door has a spill and you end up having to close down for a couple of days or a week. So, those kinds of things, weather's not all that bad, but what do you do if you can't be open for a couple of days because there's a snowstorm or something that happens like that? So you kind of have to think about these things and have a little bit of a plan in place for what happens. Now, again, here at CAA for the pandemic, for example, we had to look at the various locations rather individually because the head office, we only have one of them, for example. So we had to be really careful with this building in terms of who can come in and who can't and who works from home. But if we lose a branch, basically we have 12 branches in the province, so we can transfer the phones. Now, why I'm saying that is because, again, it's the same risk, but depending on where and what you are doing, it could be different on how you handle it. Okay. But these disaster things, basically what you have to have is a disaster recovery plan. If this happens, what am I going to do? And often as not, it means having things backed up somewhere else. And that's problematic for smaller organizations. I mean, our organization is big enough that we have a full backup of all of our server farm and everything else in Swift Current. Now, why is it in Swift Current? It's because SaskTel's internet divide. Swift Current is not on the same internet area as Regina. So that's why we put it out there, because now then at least most of the branches, if SaskTel had a significant problem, could operate from there. Now, I know that a lot of people can't handle that. If you're a 1 or 2 person organization, what do you do? Okay. So you then have to back up to the cloud or do whatever it happens to be. Now, things like weather, that's usually short term and it's usually not a big deal. And it involves, you know, who makes the call as to whether we're going to be open that day and who puts up the sign or changes the website or whatever it happens to be. So these disaster risks, again, are fairly easy to get your head wrapped around, and basically mitigating them is going to be just a plan as to what you do. So are there any questions on that kind of thing? Now, the legal risks, okay, litigation, of course, is the most obvious of these because somebody did something wrong or wasn't thinking at the time. But there's a couple of others there, okay? And most of the legal risks are around what your employees actually do, okay? Or what you do on behalf of your employees. Now, the loss of life of employee or client, I'm not talking about natural causes here. What I'm talking about is occupational health and safety. Okay, and there's been a few cases in the news lately about companies that have been fined for this, but the fine really doesn't do anything for the family. You know, you have to watch the risk of what your people are doing and have them operate safely. And you have to also do this. A lot of this one is education. Okay, so what happens here is you have to make people aware of the fact that there is a problem and what they need to do so that they don't get themselves into a pickle. Are there any questions on this one? Now, reputational, as I said, this is the one that probably A, would cause you the most level of damage, and B, could cost you the most amount of money, and C is the hardest to get your mitts on. Okay. Now, mainly this is things around what your employees do, okay? So this is things where your employees do something that, you know, is not conducive to the organization they're in. And I'll use a few examples from government over Christmas because there was a few ministers and a few things like that that went to Hawaii when I couldn't have my family home to visit. Okay, so that didn't go over really well in the middle of a pandemic. And that's what I mean by employee actions, is somebody doing something that really is not in line with what the organization is about or should be about, or is setting a bad example. And they could be as far as them doing something that's not legal. That's an extreme case, but more often than not, this is just something small. Okay, but it does encompass a fairly wide level of things. It can be in things like discrimination, for any level of any one of the discrimination things listed in the Human Rights Acts in Saskatchewan, which is everything from race, color, creed, religion, all of those. Okay. If they discriminate on those sort of areas, that's not going to be something that's going to be good for your organization. Now, I'm not talking about some organization that's advocating on behalf of a particular group in the population. Okay, that's a different thing. Okay, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And so there is going to be some discrimination there in so much as that you will advocate for one group, but not a different group. That's not the type of thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about not providing service because somebody walks in the door and doesn't agree with what your view of the world should be. Now, dead-end privacy breaches, as I said earlier, I mean, the more spectacular ones have been for large companies and credit cards. But if you're storing personal information for anybody in your computers or even on paper and files, it can be breached, okay? And there is a risk of it happening, and you do have to mitigate that risk. Now, the final thing there, I have associates do. Now, what I'm talking about is other related organizations. So again, I'll use my own situation with CAA. There is a CAA in every province in this country. Okay, we're all related to one another and we all do things together. There's no question of that. But if something happens in Alberta, it can affect everybody else in the country. So if your organization is part of a national organization, something that happens in Ontario could have an adverse effect on what's happening to you in Saskatchewan. Now, what you need to do there is, of course, particularly if they're associated organizations, is have some plan for actually dealing with when something like that happens. And we do, okay? We have a team of people across the country and that are contacts in every area. And under that team is, of course, a team of people that would mitigate the risk, whatever it happens to be, okay, or mitigate the problem by that point. And what there is a notice situation, okay? Certain things happen, and it errs on the side of caution. We get notices on these things all the time, and often as not, we don't have to deal with them. But if all of a sudden something did get out there that was huge, at least everybody would know about it, and everybody can go to the media and do all the things that you need to do. Okay. Now, just to skip back through these just quickly, okay? Strategic risk is a strategic planning process, okay? You have to, of course, go through this and decide what risks you are facing at a strategic level and have some sort of a strategic plan to go forward, okay? Financial risk is everything from reserves to alternate suppliers to those sorts of things so that you can sustain a financial downturn for a period of time. Now, that's the pre-planning. Obviously, if something lasts longer than what you had planned on, you're going to have to change your plans on the fly. But the upfront thing that you need to do is, of course, identify where these problems could come from, and then decide what can I do about it in terms of reserves or insurance or anything else that we can get our mitts on where we could financially get money. And it might even just be able to, mortgage a property and be able to borrow for a period of time. It's very simple things that you can do. Regulatory risk, there's not a lot you can do about that, but again, it's more of a planning process and an education process. Okay, we want to educate our people so that they don't do these things. Okay, and of course, we get advocacy and lobbying and things like that, but basically what we're looking at is what kind of regulatory things could come at us and what can we do. And like I said, you can lobby against it, do all of those sorts of things, but if it actually comes down, then what are we going to do about it? Operational risk is usually the proverbial plan B or C and D. Okay, what am I going to do if this particular thing happens? Okay, first of all, you have to assess whether it's going to happen, and then what am I going to do if it does? Disaster is not much you can do about it, but again, you have to have a plan in place. This is more of a planning exercise as well. It says, if we had a fire, what would we do? Okay, and it's even as much as, believe it or not, is having instructions for people on what they're supposed to do. Okay, because we are distributed all over the province, the actual dealing with the fire and all of the insurance and everything would be handled here in Regina. But if we had a fire in North Battleford, okay, first thing is get your tail out of the building, then use your cell phone to phone the fire department. Then phone Regina and we'll take it from there. Okay. And believe it or not, people phone Regina first before they phone the fire department. I would hate to say it, but they do. Okay, so again, mostly a planning process on what do we do in response to the various risks that we could face out there. Legal, again, not much you can do about it. It wouldn't hurt to have a lawyer on, on your board, things like that. It wouldn't hurt to have a lawyer that you can call from time to time, even though they charge you a lot of money. But there you go, okay? You can't do much about loss of life of people. However, what you can do is ensure that they are educated and are operating and working safely. Okay. Reputational, I've talked about. Again, basically this is a planning and educational purpose, planning and educational process. What you end up doing is educating your people all the time about how this can happen and how they can not make it happen. I get these painful things about data from our, in this way, I'm the architect of my own misery. Okay, every month we have, every staff person has to go through 1 or 2 training things on different pieces of this reputational risk stuff. And it's mostly around IT breaches, but it's around just things they should release to the public and things they shouldn't as well. And everybody has to go through it, including me, even though I'm the one that put it in place in the first place through my IT guys. Okay, but you can see it's a massive education thing around making sure that people are keeping track of what they do and thinking about things before they actually do it. And then of course, behind that, we have a whole mechanism that if somebody doesn't do that, what do we do? So are there any questions before we go on to the next section, which I'm going to talk about how do we get at what these risks are and how do we prioritize them?
Could you talk briefly about hazmat?
Okay. It depends on what you're doing, okay? The problem with hazmat is it can come at you from 2 different places, okay? If you're handling hazardous materials yourself, of course, you then, of course, are going to have a much more elevated risk than somebody who's not handling hazardous materials themselves, okay? However, what happens if, like I say, the guy next door is getting something done and it is hazardous to people's health and he doesn't bother to tell anybody, and then all of a sudden something happens? Well, you're going to evacuate your office obviously right away, things like that. But that's the kind of an education and employee planning process that I'm talking about here. You have to educate your employees based on what could happen if you're handling it yourself. Obviously, there'll be a whole regimen there. CAA owns Regina Battery Depot. We have hazardous materials in the back there for making large industrial batteries. They have acids and things like that. So there's a whole occupational health and safety regimen around that and an education process that goes on it. But now I'm talking more about the mitigation. The actual planning process was to put in place that whole mitigation process around that. Now, we're also right at that particular location, right beside CP Rail. So what happens if they dump over a tanker full of crude oil? Okay, it's not ours, but it's going to be our problem. Now, again, we're going to have a plan in place for what do we do? And it involves talking to the media, it involves talking to getting our staff out of there. And that's the primary one all the time, is make sure your staff are safe and get them out of there. Okay, but then how do we go about telling people that we're closed for the day or longer, and all of those sorts of things? Now, we won't have time today to go into this, but most of these risk mitigation things, you have to look at them in a time frame. So you look at this as, okay, is this spill going to cause me to be shut down for 1 day or 2 days? Probably not a big deal, okay? If it's going to be causing me to be down for a month, now I'm going to probably have to look at working from home, or I'm going to have to look at an alternate location. If it's going to shut me down for several months or a year, now if I'm going to operate at all, I probably have a whole different thing to do, because then I'm going to have to set up temporarily somewhere else. And that's kind of part of what I want to talk about in the next section. In identifying the risks and where you prioritize them, you can tailor your response. So did I answer the question?
Thank you, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, so what do we do? Okay, well, we have to identify any that we can think of, and that's going to be basically a brainstorming session. And we need to then do some prioritization and grouping, because if you recall right off the top, I said 80% of the work on this is going to be around 20% of the risks. And some of the risks that we can think of are so minor that we really just have not got the time and the inclination to do anything about them. Okay. And that's what that last point on that slide is all about. Once you've got them categorized and prioritized, you can work on mitigation. Until you've done that, you're going to probably be chasing around all over the place, simply because it will, the volume of some of these risks and the number of them that are out there can overwhelm the situation. Because with 6 or 8 different categories, even if there was only one in each one, okay, you've got a significant number that you would have to work on at any one time. And particularly if it's a small organization with only 1 or 2 people in it, you don't have the resources. Okay. And you have to then look at and identify what is your primary things that you need to work on and you need to mitigate, and what are things that we can do a little later. And really, the planning process is really where this gets down to in terms of mitigation. You have to have a plan in place for disaster recovery, and you have to have a plan in place for what's going to happen for all of the various risks that could be out there. Okay, so here's what we do. All right, the first step is identification. You need to know what they are, okay? And again, like I said, this is mostly a brainstorming situation. And you might want to have it facilitated the first time you can go there so that you get a bunch of opinions. And this could be your whole board, or it's just board and significant upper management. Again, if you got no budget, maybe one of your board members has seen one of these movies before and can facilitate it for you. Okay. But what we like to do, and what I like to do, is something called a storyboard, which is basically where we sit around and everybody comes up with ideas. Now, whether that's on risks or anything else. And what we do is we basically just put them all on Post-it notes and stick them on the wall. And once we've got that exercise done, we've got every idea out there, from the completely useful to the completely ridiculous. But there's no idea is ridiculous to start with, particularly in risk, because there's no risk out there that you really know that you necessarily are going to have 100% going to know how close you're going to be to actually having it happen. But you want to get it as complete as possible. And once you've got all of these risks up on the board, on the wall, now you can start to group them together as to whether they're legal or operational or financial or strategic or things like that. And no doubt 2 or 3 people may have come up with the same idea, or just different slants on the same idea. So you can group things together. And that's what a storyboard is all about. Okay. But that's the method we use here. And it's the method that I would recommend you use, because it gets more people involved and you get more diverse. Well, people look at things from different eyes, let's put it that way. Okay, so you get some more diverse things coming at you. The chances are you're going to get more towards the last point there, where you get completeness and you get more things that are out there. Now, it's a double-edged sword. You don't want to get too many, as I said. But having said that, at least you can get as many as you possibly can. Okay, so is there anything on this identification process?
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
It's about getting people to start. Like, I find it hard to get people's attention to even think about, for example, risk to reputation. And yet, to me, how people speak about your organization in the community, that's really important.
Oh, that's probably the most important thing. Now, you're not going to please everybody, but having said that, you want to get most of them that way. What I would do, okay, is think of something on your own and put that out as the seed and say, okay, what I'm looking for here is what would happen if, okay? And to use something rather extreme, we're a child care organization and we've got a child molester on the board. Okay, what would happen if? All right, and get them thinking and then say, okay, and okay, that's a very extreme one, but what would happen if? And just have a list of 3 or 4 that you already know you've got and get them to start to try and think a little broader. And even some of the categorization that I've talked about today can get people thinking about these on a broader spectrum, because they may not think about the fact that there's, we're never going to get sued. But yeah, there is a legal liability out there. Okay. So does that help?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we've now identified what these are. The next thing is to try and assess a priority. Now, what we try to do here is to try and make this something. We try and do an abstract to get it into a number. Okay. And what we look at is the likelihood of the risk actually happening and the impact of it. Okay. And we make a 5-point scale for likelihood and a 5-point scale for impact, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay. We use the same scale for all risks, no matter whether they think they're minor or not. We still put them on the same scale. And we capture both financial and reputational risks. Okay. We don't leave the reputational risks off of this thing simply because they might not cost us any money. In the long term, we feel that reputational risk will probably cost us money anyway. Okay. And it'll be because of a lost funding or lost sales or something. Okay. So what does that look like? All right. Now, this is fictitious numbers, but you can see I'm going to try and assign a rating here of 1 through 5. Okay. And what I'm looking at is the frequency that it could occur and the probability that it will occur. Okay. So what's happening here is with the frequency of occurrence is this could happen 2-3 times a year if we weren't careful, or it might only happen every 5 years, or it might only happen every 10 years, or maybe it's 1 in 100. I don't know. Okay. But what I'm trying to figure out here is how often could this actually occur? And then on top of that, I'm going to actually go and do one more thing and see if I can assign a probability. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this, but you do want to get some sort of a scale going that rates these as how likely they are to occur. Okay. So something like a weather occurrence, it's fairly likely. Okay. This is Saskatchewan. We're going to get a blizzard or 2 in the wintertime. Now, here, of course, that has a double-edged sword. It may mean our branches are closed, but it also may mean our tow trucks are busy. Okay. So again, we have to look at the frequency of that. And of course, that's going to happen every year. And basically, there's a 100% probability of it going to happen. There's going to be 1 or 2 days in the winter, if not a couple of weeks, where it's 40 below and snowing. Okay. Now we look at something else and we say, okay, what about, trying to think of one off the top of my head quickly. Well, okay, let's look at something like a data breach. Okay. It's probably not going to happen very often. Okay. It might happen once every 5 years, if at all, hopefully never at all. Okay. But it's not going to be something that happens every day. Okay. So from a frequency point of view, it's going to go down the line. It may well have a higher probability, but nevertheless, I can assign a rating that's not a 5 here. Okay. The weather related one I was talking about here is going to happen every year. So I know it's going to have to, it's got a very high likelihood of happening. The data breach may be down in the 2-3 range or 3-4 range because it's not as likely to happen. Okay. Because we have a lot of security and safety guards in place. Now, it's not that it can't happen. Okay. There's lots of people who thought they had their security in place and didn't, but it is a little lower on the rating scale. Okay. So are there any questions on what I'm trying to get at here? What we're trying to say is this is the risk. How often might it happen? Okay. The risk of our building burning down is probably a 1. Okay. It's all fire protected. It's sprinklered. It's got fire suppression all over the place. It's got fire alarms. There's a big fire hose right outside my door. Okay. So there's all kinds of things there. And of course, we are always upgrading and checking and making sure that it gets inspected, and the fire department does that for us. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We're looking at something that is very likely to happen, or something that's not very likely to happen, or somewhere in between. Now, is this a lot of guesswork? Yes, it is. Okay. There's no question you need to use professional judgment. I'll use that term to be more, make it sound a little better than guesswork. Okay. But there's no question you have to assess how often something's going to occur. And you'll see why in a minute. But again, are there any questions on this likelihood area? Now, you don't have to use frequency and probability. It's just basically frequency likely you would use, the probability maybe not. But basically all we're trying to get here is, am I facing this daily? Am I facing it weekly? Am I facing it maybe never? Okay, now the impact, I put it in financial terms here, simply because, like I say, this is the easiest one where we can get at the impact. The reputational one's a little harder, but you can even tie it to a financial impact, okay? If we had a reputational problem and our donations dropped in half, what's the value of that particular problem? That would be the impact of it, okay? So that's why I'm using finances here, because usually you can attach a dollar figure to something, if not directly, at least indirectly, okay? And again, I put a rating scale of 1 to 5. And of course, 5 is very expensive and 1 is not very expensive, okay? And again, these numbers are fairly arbitrary, but keep in mind that something doesn't have to be, a very small thing can cost you a lot of money. I mean, those credit card breaches where they stole everybody's information quite literally cost those companies in the hundreds of millions of dollars to actually repair that. The actual fix to the software so the guy couldn't get in again probably was done in a day and probably for under $1,000. But by the time they had done all the media work and had bought credit protection for everybody and had replaced all the credit cards, because the credit card company charged them to do that, you can see what happens in a hurry. This can balloon out of control quite quickly. So, but we still have to come up with some sort of an impact rating here. And financially is usually the easiest way to do it. And like I said, it may take a second step there. Okay, somebody does something stupid. Okay, it's going to impact our reputation badly. Okay, so what's that reputation problem going to do to us? Okay, so you may have to take it that second step to get to finances, but it's usually the easiest way to do this. So is there any question on what I'm talking about here? Okay, once you've done that, you can plot each risk on this thing, okay? If it's got a high likelihood and will have a high impact, then you've got a high risk zone, okay? We should be paying close attention to anything that has a very high likelihood of happening and a very high impact if it does, okay? And of course, 5, 4, I've kind of put those, top 2 together as high risk for everything there. Now, if something is not very likely to happen, but has a high impact, okay, or even down to a more medium impact, we get that kind of a medium high range here. I've made that one a fairly broad band, the medium and the medium low, fairly broad band. But we're looking at a lesser risk than what we would have if it's very likely to happen and has a high impact. Okay. Then what we look at, we say, okay, well, wait a minute, it has no impact at all, and it has no likelihood. Well, okay, well, that one would, whoop, back up, Jack. Not there yet. Okay. Then now what? Okay, well, I don't really likely have to spend a lot of time on this. It doesn't mean I ignore them, okay? We can put this down and basically say, all right, it's very low risk. And if it does happen to happen, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to spend my time up in this red and, well, I meant it to be kind of an orangey zone. It's more brown than orange, but anyway, up in this area here. So if they drop into a 5.4 or a 5.3, even down to a 5.2, that's the ones I'm going to spend my most time on. Okay, so is there any questions on why I'm looking at this likelihood versus impact thing? You're going to look at each and every risk and plot them on this matrix somehow.
Dave, this is Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Just a comment. I really think this is a great visual. I haven't seen it done quite like this. I've seen it done just numerically with like a score. So I love this. Thank you for sharing. And just I would comment that I know in the past when I've gone through this work, giving examples as you plot these as a likelihood and impact was really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, what would a 5.5 look like, and to be able to talk about what that example would be. And then it helps, like, say, if you have a committee you're working with or your full board that's doing this work, it helps bring some consistency to assigning the numbers.
Yeah. Now we do score it. Okay. We put a priority on it, 1 through 5. Okay. But that's after we've done this. Okay. And the reason we score it is simply so that we can do the next thing I want to talk about. Okay. We're going to spend most of our time working on things that are scored 1s, okay, and 2s. All right. We're going to spend a little less time on 3s, okay, and on down the line. All right. I must stress that we do have a plan in place for everyone that we can possibly think of, even the low ones. We've got a little bit of a plan in place. And it can be as simple as basically having an insurance policy. Okay. It's not that we necessarily have to spend a lot of time, but I'm not losing any sleep over the 4s and 5s most of the time. I'm losing sleep over the 1s and 2s. Okay. And the 1s and 2 priority dropped out of where they fell in here. Okay. So if we put this likelihood versus impact, if it fell in this high zone, it would get a priority of 1. Okay. If it fell in this orange zone, it would get a priority of 2. If it fell down in the green one and the dark green one, it would fall down here. Okay. Again, are there any questions on that? Okay, the final one, of course, is mitigation. Now that you got them all listed, grouped, and prioritized, you can work on the mitigation. So you list them and a list of what makes up that risk. And then, of course, you brainstorm a process to manage for it, identify who's responsible to manage for it. And basically, if you're building a mitigation strategy, you can put some targets in there. And you should monitor this. Now, I put it as monitor process on mitigation, but you have to monitor this ongoing, because the risks, some risks go away and some get worse. So you have to monitor this whole thing on an ongoing basis. And there's a question here to Karen on sharing the slides. And yes, I haven't sent them to Lynn yet, but I intend to do that. And I assume she will send them out to everybody that's on the thing. The reason I haven't sent them to Lynn yet is because usually I'm one of these guys that I should quit second guessing myself, because I make changes up to 5 minutes before I make the presentation. So if I sent them to her yesterday, they wouldn't be the same as today. But anyway, long story short, we will actually send these out. Okay. So that's the process of mitigation. We've got the list of them. We've prioritized them. Now we have to make a plan to do whatever it happens to be. Okay. So, and often this again is another brainstorming process, particularly on the ones that are high risk, because by their very nature, they're difficult to solve. Okay, what do you do if you can't operate in the morning for the next year? Okay, So, you know, and there's probably also in a lot of these things, there's more than one thing. I you know, there's more than one thing can possibly be done, or it may be a process of things that have to be done. So we go from there. Now, what we do is we do this thing that we call our risk register, okay? And it's a document that summarizes all these and puts them in their priorities that we keep on our intranet that our senior management can get at. And it's incumbent on us to make sure we're looking after this all the time. And that sometimes is the hardest thing to do. You know, we dig this thing out at least once a year and dust it off and make sure it's still relevant and all of those sorts of things. Because the day-to-day operations get in the road, right? But we at least have the comfort knowing that we have done this at least once a year. And then once a year, we also do, we didn't do it this year because of the pandemics, and we may not get to it this year again, depending on whether we can get people together again, or we may try to do it virtually. But what we also did once a year was we took this thing out, and not only did we dust it off and fix it up, we had because we had all the management and a few of the senior, you know, middle managers in one place at one time, we do a scenario situation. So we actually put a scenario out there and say, this is what's happened. What are you going to do? Okay. And of course, they have to consult their plan and they have to go through it and make sure that it works. Okay. At least to the extent that you can test it. Okay. So if this happened and you wanted to implement the plan that you say you've got to do it, okay, let's go through your plan a step at a time and see who's supposed to do what. And we ask the questions outright without giving them the chance to go back to their plan. So what happens is, okay, if this has happened, who's supposed to be the first one that gets called? So that it does remain a little bit top of mind for some people, because this thing can end up gathering dust with a whole bunch of other plans that are out there. And what I wanted to do was say, is that if you have something at least all in one place, you then can at least have a process where you update it quarterly or annually or whatever it happens to be. And if worst comes to worst, people can get at it if they need to. Okay. And by the way, it doesn't hurt to have a paper backup of an electronic copy. Now, you want to develop this thing with your boards and any significant stakeholders. Okay, and it really has to be incorporated into your basic operations and your operational and strategic planning process. Okay, now this is what the thing looks like. All right, now it's a little bit small, I get that, and if you're on a small screen, it's even worse. All right, but you can see we've categorized it. All right, and I've just put a couple of theoretical ones in here, okay? And I just picked two strategic ones because they're usually the harder ones that are harder to get at, okay? And we've transferred in from our matrix our high, medium, low thing, okay? And we put our priority number in here, okay? So basically what happens is if this is a database, which it is, okay, I can actually sort and find all the number one priorities and see whether we should be working on them, okay? Now, erosion of relevance can have a number of factors, okay? And you have to identify what these factors are so that you can have some idea of what your plan to manage it is going to be, okay? So new technology replacing a core service. A cure for cancer. I know it's not there anytime soon, but I just, you know, something comes along that takes away your entire reason for being, okay? And I was talking about that earlier with the CNIB stuff. Okay, a lot of the stuff that they can do now with lasers on your macula took away macular degeneration and lens replacement for cataracts and things like that. Whereas, you know, 50 years ago, they couldn't do those surgeries. And you had to then, of course, deal with the fact that that was happening to people. Okay, so that's where we're going with this. But that's the kind of thing that I want to have in here. What are the different, okay, this is a very broad general statement, but where can it come at me from? Okay. And then, of course, I need to say what I'm going to do. Okay. So if something is replacing it, okay, I need to make sure my client experience is very good so that they know that it's memorable. They'll come back and see me. Okay. And things like that. Okay. And again, this is going to be a brainstorming. I can't get very specific on any one specific thing because, of course, you've got a broad general topic here. You've assessed whether it's a high priority or not. If it is, where can it come at me? And then what can I do about it? And who's responsible for making sure this works? Okay. Now, the reason we do this is particularly when we get to the operating sections, we've got 5 operating vice presidents that operate the different business lines that we look for. Okay. And because of that, of course, when you're in an operating area, it doesn't matter to me. Well, I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. That's not the right term. It matters to me, but it doesn't matter to me from an operational perspective of what's going on from a hazmat thing over at Regina Battery Depot. Okay. That is another operating area that is somebody else's problem. Now, what I say it doesn't matter to me, what I'm saying is it doesn't matter to me on a day-to-day basis in terms of how they are doing the safety and all of that kind of thing. That's their problem. They need to do that. Okay. But it does matter to me from a point of view of the overall organization. But if I'm going to assign somebody to actually look after what this risk is about, okay, then I need to do this. And of course, the smaller the organization, sometimes the person responsible, you can skip this column because if you're looking for the person responsible, you look in the mirror. Okay. But having said that, it does help, particularly if you've got several categories here, to spread this around a little bit so that again, it works for, it's looked at more often and is more complete. Okay. Now, then the other one I picked was new competitors could disrupt the basis of service delivery. Okay. The organization has changed. We're in the travel business. Now this has been ongoing for 30 years, so it's it's not anything new. Okay, at one time, when they set up the travel business in this organization many, many years ago, it was the business to be in. Okay, you could make good commission on all the things you sold and everything else. But everything from online to disintermediation from the actual suppliers and them going directly through a website to sell their stuff has cut the travel agent out of a lot of what they used to sell. Okay, and that continues to happen and will continue to happen. So that's on our radar all the time. The nature of that organization and how it's working has and will change significantly as we go on. And it's actually going to probably change significantly as we come out of this pandemic when people are allowed to travel again. And that's one of the hot button topics around here right now is okay, how? Okay. But this was a risk on our radar and has been and will be for quite some time. And basically, we got to move with the flow. There's not a lot that we can do about what's happening from the people outside of our organization. But if we're innovating and doing the things we need to do to make sure that we stay relevant and pick up the next good thing that's coming along instead of the bum that we can't sell anymore, then we'll be okay. Okay. Now, that's the nature of this animal. It can be as simple as a spreadsheet, or it can be as complex as a database. Like I say, we got it in a bit of a database. But basically, when I'm looking at risk, I have to identify what it is. I want to prioritize it. Okay, and now to come up with a strategy for mitigation, and then I'm going to monitor it. Okay, from the point of view of, is the risk changing? And does my response to it have to change? And is the risk itself as a higher priority as it was? All of those things that go into keeping it at the top of our list. Now that's kind of where I wanted to leave it today. I didn't want to get too much into exact risks because of course we're two diverse of organizations and the risks are going to be different for everybody else. But the categorization I gave you, most people should have something of a risk in virtually all of those categories and maybe one or two more. And hopefully, if you can get the risks identified and prioritized, then you can start to grapple with which ones I need to have a plan to change and which ones I don't. So with that, I'll kind of throw it open to questions. Well, I know we're a little bit early, but well, we'll see how it goes.
It's Jane again. I wonder, since there's silence, can you talk some more about the risk factors related to reputation?
Whoop, try again, Jane. I lost it in the warble.
Risk factors related to a loss of reputation.
Okay. Well, like I say, a reputational risk is one where the public, by definition, is something that's going to be adverse. Okay. Now, how likely is it to happen is how many touch points do you have with the public? And at each touch point, what is the probability of something going wrong? Okay. So that's kind of where we take it, is we just basically say, okay, our, by the way, CAA is right now the most trusted brand in Canada by a couple of different surveys. And of course, we have to protect that. All right. So what we want to make sure is that our employees, A, know that, and B, aren't doing something that would cause us to be a problem. So in other words, and then we went through and said a whole bunch of different things that could possibly happen that would cause that to be a problem. All right. And I hate to say it, but most of it boils down to somebody doing something stupid. You know, it's things like, right now, it's things like a tow truck driver shows up without his mask on in the middle of the pandemic. Okay, it sounds like a simple thing. All right. But those guys they're frontline workers in terms of this. And, you know, they're going out and they're pulling somebody's car someplace. The person may or may not be there. Okay, we can't leave the person stranded on the road. So we end up having to put them into the tow truck. So we've got a supply of masks and hand sanitizer. So when the person gets in, if they don't have their own mask, et cetera, they can do it. But then, of course, if it ever got out that we were just going along and saying, well, okay, who cares? Our tow truck drivers don't wear masks. We don't have any sanitizer in the thing. What would that do to our reputation? Okay, we're an unsafe organization that's advocating safety. All right, well, you know, what that's going to mean is I can't sell memberships, particularly if it got a widespread thing in the media. Okay. So that's the kind of thing. And that's why they're tough to nail down, is because you got to look at all the various things that could happen beyond the actual incident to see what's going to be the actual impact of this thing. Okay. So it's, you know, that's a simple example that I can think of right off the top of my head. Even within the organization, there's things that you can look at that are a risk. You know, and I'm thinking more data things and that kind of stuff. But, you know, one that we grapple with again is that we have to have very secure systems, and we have more security in a lot of our people consider the security that we have around our computers and around all of the things that we do here more than is necessary. And we've got a whole education process around that. But, and basically is scare the pants off them and see what happens. But anyway, anyway, what I'm talking about here is that we get probably, you know, we monitor intrusions onto we're widespread. So we've got a wide area network. We're exposed to the internet as much as anybody could be. Okay. And we get probably 2 to 3 people trying every week to get into our systems, and sometimes more often than that. But we get a minimum of 2 or 3 a week where somebody's trying to hack our systems. And the reason is because we advertise on our website that we have automatic credit card renewal for your membership. So the guys out there that do that kind of thing are sitting there saying, well, okay, well, if they do that, then they've got to have credit card numbers stored somewhere. Okay. And they're trying to probe our systems because they're hoping to get into our system and steal the credit card numbers. Now, as it happens, we don't carry the credit card numbers in our systems. We have a cross-referencing system with a company that's much better at securing credit card numbers than we are. Okay, so even if they got in, they're not going to get much more than your name, rank, and serial number, but even that's not good. Okay, people have given us a phone number in confidence because it's an unlisted number. Well, you don't want that getting out there. So now what do we do? Okay. Within the organization, okay, we have to make people brutally aware that there's all kinds of ways that people can get your password and all of those sorts of things very easily. And they have to be aware of like something as simple as they have to check every day and make sure somebody hasn't slipped a credit card skimmer into one of our credit card machines. Okay, it's not hard to do, but I mean, it's something they have to be aware of. Because if it ever got out there that we have all of this personal information on people and we're not protecting it in any way, shape, or form, again, the sub of that is, of course, we can't sell any memberships. So it has an ongoing financial risk, and sooner or later, the organization just doesn't exist. So that's kind of a long way around, but what I'm trying to get at is that these things can come at you from outside, they can come at you from inside, and basically, if it's going to harm your reputation, which it will, then at some point in time, it's going to have a financial impact, or it's going to take the organization down completely. I mean, there's been some, rather famous ones where the organization just did not survive one of these reputational things that happened. Now, there's a question on the board here about the risk register in terms of that. Annual is kind of the least frequent times you should do it. You should at least do it annually, but it's as often as you feel necessary, okay? So our board mandates that we do it annually, but I can tell you as an executive, we look at it probably quarterly. Okay. Okay, there's another question here about identify the risk of a loss of government or other funding and how do we mitigate it? That one's a tough one to mitigate, particularly if you're working basically from year to year, for lack of better terms. Okay, the government funds this for 1 year and that's it. Okay, now what you have to basically do is say, okay, is the program worthwhile continuing? And if it is, and I can't get government funding, what are my other sources of funding? Now, basically, this is what reserves are about. Now, believe it or not, a not-for-profit can have a level of reserve. All right, it's not CRA, not-for-profit doesn't mean you make $0 every year. Okay, it does mean that you can build up reserves. All right, now there's rules and regulations around that in CRA. Okay, and a CRA that is the one that you have to talk about. You get the what is it, the T3010, is it? I can't remember the charity registration return. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but anyway, and there's a not-for-profit return that you have to do every year. Well, they monitor what you're up to, and they won't let you get tons and tons of money, but they will let you have some reserve funds. Now, the reserve funds will then allow you to operate for a particular period of time. Now, it won't be long, but it'll do one of two things for you. It'll either allow you to wind the program down, quotes, nicely, okay? In other words, it's just not closed in the morning, so you've got a month or two to, notify everyone, figure out what else they could do, those sorts of things. And also you can look at all the programs you've got, and if there are some that you are doing because they're nice to have, maybe those funds get shifted to the more high priority programs. But in terms of actual mitigation, in terms of your plan, About the only thing that you've got out there for a loss of funding is another source of funding. And you probably have to have a bridge reserve to get you through to get to that other source of funding. So I don't know, Karen, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I didn't have the answer either, but you know, that environmental scanning, you know, watching the trends, trying to get ahead, I guess, of potential changes in the wind. Any thoughts on that?
That is 100% what this is about, is trying to get yourself ahead of the curveball. Okay? Because you're going to have the curveball thrown at you, but you know, can I do something about it when I get there? And that's what this is all about. You can't mitigate what you don't know is coming at you. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to know everything that's coming at you. I get that. But having said that, if you can at least have the major ones that you know about, you've got some idea. Because, you know, often as not, a lot of the mitigation strategies will transfer from one to another. So what happens is you've got a mitigation strategy for this particular thing. Wait a minute, you know, 9 out of the 10 things that we're going to do for that one will work for this one as well, even though it's not on our list. Okay? It's almost a way of thinking as well, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It's so interesting. And you raised a point which is maybe a discussion for another workshop or another series, which is, you know, how do we evaluate our programs? So if there is a tough decision to be made, like how do we know what it is costing us to deliver one program over another and the return on that?
Yeah, that's kind of why I was talking in the earlier sessions on the financial statements and things like that, was to why you want to subdivide it up and have at least some idea of what's going on in each of your programs. You don't necessarily have to give all that detail to everyone and their dog, but having said that, at least you then have some idea of what you can do and what you can't.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great approach. And then also, you know, from the outcomes and the evaluation piece of it, knowing, you know, for your mission and your mandate, or, you know, and the cost, is this
Yeah.
the right place to put our attention and our money given the outcomes we want to achieve?
Yep. That almost is part of a strategic planning process. You know, you would start with saying, okay, these are the programs we've got right now, and you break it down. It's almost a zero-based thing. This is what we've got now. Okay, is it relevant? Yes or no? Do we need to keep it? Yes or no? You know, it almost becomes a triage tree type of thing, and work your way through it. And if you get to the end of the day and it says, yes, we need it, and yes, it absolutely has to be there, okay, then it has to have priority from a funding point of view and every other point of view that's out there. Okay. Again, as I said earlier, I will ship these slides off to Lynn right away and go from there. Hopefully the 3 sessions, if you've been in all 3, have given people some idea of what we're doing, because I mean, really in an hour to an hour and a half, we only scratch the surface, unfortunately. You know, again, what I'm trying to get at is for people is something that at least if you can take it away and think about it and adapt it and do whatever you need to do, then I'm a happy camper. It will be a success from my point of view.
Well, if we don't have any further questions, I would just like to take this moment to thank you, Dave. You've been just wonderful to work with, and I've gotten lots of great feedback through emails by people saying that you have a really good way of making really complicated things sound a little bit simpler. And you know, I know myself, having attended all 3 sessions, are going away with, you know, lots of food for thought and knowledge of things that I need to kind of spend some more time learning. And that's all that we can really ask for in short sessions like this, is that we go away with a little bit of knowledge and know where to go in the future. I'd like to thank my wonderful partner in this series, Karen Henders from the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. She really rose to the challenge today when I called her, texted her like 15 minutes before the session and said, the power is off. Can you step in for me? So thank you very much for that. Definitely, there was no risk management thought there for a one-person shop. And there's not very many times when I will have to worry about kind of significant risks in the job that I do, but there are some, and that kind of brainstorming that you talked about, Dave, is definitely something that I will need to do. Anyone who is not on the Community Engagement and Research Center email list but wants to be, please do let me know. I can add you to that. We will, Karen and I are just brainstorming ideas for our next series, which will likely be in the fall. And we're looking at having some human resource professionals help come up with some sessions for us. But we're always wanting this to be community driven. So any ideas that you have that you want to, that you think would be helpful to us, please let us know as we start doing our planning. And with that, I think I'm going to just close the session with I hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and take care of yourselves out there.